Want to see something hateful and divisive? If the answer is no, my advice is to avoid the comment sections of news stories on social media, especially with another nasty election coming up in the United States. If the answer is yes, well, I guess you must be having a pretty good time online these days. But also, I must question your sanity. In today's video, we'll tackle the big question: why does the political culture on social media seem so radical and polarized? Why does it feel like every other person you see online is some kind of doom-spiraling socialist or neo-Nazi nationalist? What happened to all the normal people? Most people today consider the apparently worsening political divide in America to be one of our most pressing social problems. Fortunately, we'll find some pretty good answers to these questions from a reading of sociologist Chris Bale's soon-to-be modern classic, Breaking the Social Media Prism: How to Make Our Platforms Less Polarizing. Chris Bale is one of the up-and-comers of the contemporary sociology scene. His big data approach to sociology at Duke University's Polarization Lab has garnered him recognition as not only an expert on digital political culture, but also one of the trailblazers of computational social science. Since receiving his PhD at Harvard in 2011, he's been remarkably well received by both academics and the public at large, having published work in prestigious journals like Nature and Science, in addition to having several acclaimed books to his name. Chris Bale is thus considered a pioneer of a burgeoning methodological movement in sociology that draws heavily from data science. In Breaking the Social Media Prism, Bale combines a computational approach with in-depth interviews. Young enough to have been among the first generation of social media users and smart enough to write a book, Chris Bale seems like the right guy to give us some perspective on our current polarized media landscape. Why does the internet seem so extreme? Most people who are informed about topics like this might be tempted to start blaming echo chambers for the state of political disarray. Well, it's not a bad start, but as we'll come to see, the problem is actually so much worse than that. An echo chamber is a media environment where individuals are exposed only to information and opinions that reinforce their own beliefs. Everything else is filtered out of this environment, either by algorithms that have determined that the user won't like it, or by friendship and acquaintance networks, which tend to be similar to us demographically and ideologically. Bale's research indicates that echo chambers can indeed contribute to political polarization. However, his work also suggests that echo chambers may just be a symptom of a much deeper problem. If the problem is echo chambers, then the solution is kind of easy, right? In theory, we could fix that. Just tweak the algorithm so everyone is exposed to more moderating or contrasting content. Jack Dorsey, the ex-CEO of Twitter, considered doing something like this. Unfortunately, there is little conclusive evidence that such interventions would lead to a more even-keeled social media environment. In experiments he conducted on social media platforms, Bale and his team at the Polarization Lab found that exposure to opposing political views does not always lead to reduced polarization. In fact, it often seemed to have a disturbing, counterintuitive effect. Social media users who were exposed to differing political opinions often took even more extreme political positions than before. But why? Well, Bale saw that when users are confronted with opposing viewpoints, they often react defensively, not with curiosity or open-mindedness. This defensive reaction can lead to a backfire effect, where instead of reconsidering their beliefs, individuals double down on them. As Bale put it, unenthusiastic partisans do not carefully review new information about politics when they are exposed to opposing views on social media and adapt their views accordingly. Instead, they experience stepping outside their echo chamber as an attack on their identity. This is because their echo chambers were actually insulating them from the most insulting and egregious attacks on their preferred political party. Bale reminds us that we don't actually need some kind of weird digital architecture to develop hatred for each other. Collective identity can naturally lead to conflict when groups that develop in isolation from each other come into contact. In other words, it's not entirely fair to blame Dorsey and Zuckerberg for the faults of human psychology. Bale's finding, which was validated in a follow-up study at MIT, is at least enough to cast doubt on the echo chamber theory of political polarization. We all just assume that polarization is an artifact of these scary digital structures we call echo chambers. But what if these structures are reflections of the fact that we were already polarized in the first place? What if the problem of the echo chamber lies within how people normally behave in groups instead of within the code? It's an interesting chicken and egg problem, but it may not even be the key to understanding polarization. In fact, Bale thinks the more important mechanism behind the issue of polarization and extremism on social media is something that he calls the social media prism. According to Bale, social media platforms function as prisms that distort users' social identities, inflating the importance and visibility of their most radical or polarizing viewpoints. This happens in large part because more extreme content is more likely to generate engagement in the form of likes, shares, and comments. The naturally inflammatory and controversial nature of radical, insulting, and often annoying viewpoints creates a feedback loop of escalating extremism because social media algorithms are designed to promote content that receives more engagement. After all, engagement is their bread and butter. No distinction is made between controversy and quality. As long as these platforms can keep us online, they can keep monetizing our data, charging good rates to advertisers, and so on. It doesn't matter if our experience is dominated by fear, anger, joy, or hope, as long as we keep coming back for more. When a social media post garners a lot of attention, whether positive or negative, it is more likely to be shown to others. This can escalate extreme viewpoints or outlier opinions, making them appear more mainstream than they are in reality. One thing to keep in mind here is that there is good reason to believe that participation in political activity online is severely asymmetrical. A 2019 report from Pew Research Center showed that prolific political tweeters make up just 6% of all Twitter users, but generate 20% of all tweets, and 73% of tweets mentioning national politics. And here's the kicker. Extremists represented nearly half of all prolific political tweeters. For me, this begs the question of what actually qualifies as extremism, but I guess I'm satisfied with this citation to the extent that it seems to show that the average political tweet is probably not a very good representative of the average set of political positions that exist in society. In the political sociology literature, we call the perception gap between how polarized people view their political environment to be and how polarized it actually is false polarization. In America, this phenomenon goes back at least to the 1990s, amid the so-called culture wars that pitted the traditional values of the Republican Party against the Democrats' belief in social welfare. As partisan attacks between high-ranking politicians like Newt Gingrich and Bill Clinton escalated and became the norm, the American public quite reasonably began to think that this theatrical animosity was a reflection of the broader political culture. After all, politicians represent us, right? Well, not really. We tend to perceive political elites as conduits of public opinion, but when sociologists and social psychologists like Paul DiMaggio and Robert Robinson began to study this problem, they found that the average American wasn't actually becoming more polarized. Rather, the average American simply thought that everyone else was becoming more polarized, likely because of their repeated exposure to televised incivility among the country's political leaders. Bale thinks something similar is happening on social media. The polarization we see is not representative of reality, but extremists are emboldened by their perception that it is. Next thing you know, someone gets shot to death storming the United States Capitol building, convinced that the silent majority is behind them. But the silent majority, according to Bale, is not behind the radicals. If anything, it's hiding from them. In many ways, breaking the social media prism is a story of how political moderates end up marginalized on social media platforms. We've already discussed how moderates are algorithmically disadvantaged by way of the fact that their views are less likely to generate engagement than extreme content. But moderates are also treated differently by other social media users. Bale observed that individuals who attempt to present balanced or moderate views are often targeted by both sides of a polarized debate. In fact, Bale calculates that people who identified as slightly liberal or slightly conservative were about 40% more likely to report being harassed online than those who identified as extremely liberal or conservative. People with radical political opinions tend to see those with moderate views as enemies, regardless of their party. Attacking moderates can serve as a kind of social signaling among extreme groups, reinforcing their ideological purity and group identity boundaries by ostracizing those who do not fully conform to the group's more radical views. Bale believes that partisan warfare on social media has little to do with convincing other people. In his words, "The research my colleagues and I conducted suggests that social media give extremists a sense of purpose, community, and, most importantly, self-worth." From this angle, partisan warfare would appear to be more of a ritual than a debate, with no place for the moderate other than the sacrificial altar. This hostile digital culture discourages moderates from offering their opinions, making them seem ever less numerous. According to Bale, The social media prism makes the other side appear monolithic, unflinching, and unreasonable. While extremists captivate our attention, moderates can seem all but invisible. What results is a social media environment where the extremes seem to be the norm. But what can we do about it? Well, a lot of the polarization we witness in our online lives is still likely to be false polarization. Bale cites research conducted in 2016 suggesting that perceived differences between Democratic and Republican parties were roughly 2 times larger than in reality. According to Bale, the problem may not be so much that social media is polarizing us, but that it has sent our sense of false polarization into hyperdrive. The first step we need to take is recognizing that the social media prism exists, and that what we see online is not necessarily a perfect reflection of culture at large. The second step is to try to see ourselves through the prism. Becoming more aware of how one's political views relate to those of others can have a depolarizing effect, no matter where you fall on the political spectrum. Finally, we can take steps to break our own prisms. Bale espouses a baby steps approach, whereby we cut ourselves off from polarizing thought leaders and make more effort to experience viewpoints that are mostly aligned but still substantively different from our own. For radicals, that can mean learning to talk to the moderates first. Overall, I have mixed feelings about this book. I do recommend this book to my students because it uses some great experimental evidence to take a shot at one of the leading theories of political polarization, and then goes one step further to suggest some alternative explanations. In other words, it's not merely deconstructive. This is some top-shelf social science, and very clearly communicated too. Bale provides a convincing new perspective on the political culture of social media. I'm less worried about the echo chamber effect and polarization in general than I used to be. But at the same time, I have problems. For me, this book really fell off in the last 2 chapters, where Bale provides some evidence-based suggestions for how we can counter polarization in our own lives. Bale also references his data to imagine what it might take to design a non-polarized platform. He suggests that anonymity might be of benefit, as there is evidence that it disentangles people from the identity-based conflicts that drive polarization. He also discusses the possibility of implementing incentive structures that reward content with bipartisan appeal and downrank more extreme content. And it's not that I doubt his recommendations would work. He seems to have a great grasp of the mechanics at play. But what really bothered me is that beneath the surface, these sections are extremely political. Bale's recommendations take it for granted that moderation is best, and yet he doesn't acknowledge that this is a controversial political position. Now you may be thinking, Andy, what are you talking about? Extremism on social media is a social problem which must be solved. But is it really? All hegemonic ideas start on the fringes. Here's a few people who were considered extremists in their day: George Washington, Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks. Almost everyone loves these people now because society has shifted around their values, but they were enormously divisive and polarizing figures when they were alive. The fact is, extreme media have been an inherent part of the historical development of American political culture since Thomas Paine penned Common Sense in 1776. Throughout the book, Bale characterizes extremists mostly as dangerous bullies, but some of them have ideas that we need to hear, whether or not they're communicated in ways we consider to be friendly, palatable, or civilized. I think this is made all the more relevant by the fact that the criteria for what polarizing or extreme content is seems to broadly include anything that is divisive or makes a lot of people uncomfortable. Bale suggests, for example, that artificial intelligence could be used to ask people who are about to post uncivil or ad hominem content to reflect upon their goals, or to help people rephrase their messages using values that appeal to the other side. But if I'm going to be talking about political issues that I think are important, the last thing I want is to be algorithmically tone-policed by a multinational corporation. I'll be the judge of what is and is not properly civil, thanks. It's quite obvious that political division can be deadly, but political consensus can be even deadlier. For example, the Holocaust. Typically, there must be a high level of political consensus in society in order for it to be possible to orchestrate such extreme forms of systematic oppression. In short, I don't think Bale properly accounts for what we stand to lose when we problematize polarizing content. So, let's briefly recap by returning to our original question. Why does the political culture on social media today seem so polarized? Echo chambers are part of it, but as it turns out, the vast majority of people aren't actually inside of them. And in fact, taking people outside of their echo chambers might serve to make them even more extreme. Political polarization in America is real, but it may not be as bad as it appears. Extreme, insulting, and agitating content is much more likely to be posted and algorithmically promoted on social media than more moderate views, which can create a sense of false polarization for all users. This triggers a feedback loop, where moderate voices are driven further and further into the margins. First of all, because they don't want to deal with being harassed by ideologues, and second, because they have lost perspective on how much support they really have from other users. The result is a media ecosystem where the political culture is dictated by an active and extreme but non-representative minority. So yeah, that's all for today. If you learned something cool, you can support this decidedly level-headed content by liking or subscribing. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments, and hopefully, I'll see you in the next video.